All right, let's talk a little bit about music notation. First of all, if you get on Wikipedia, what's it saying? In standard Western music notation, tones are represented graphically by symbols, notes placed on a staff. So notes, you have notes, and the notes that we've already talked about, and the staff. This is the staff. And, on a vertical axis corresponding to pitch, so up and down, talking about pitch of the note, and horizontal axis corresponding to time, going which way is it going, and that's time, represented by measures. So, the other thing is note heads, shapes, stems, flags, ties, and dots. So you've got dots and ties and flag head shapes and things like that that are going to be representative of time. That's a real simple explanation, and there's other additional symbols to indicate dynamics, accents, rests, and different times to represent whatever you're composing, and that's a real simple understanding of it. So let's just take a look at it. All right, we'll talk about notes first of all. Let's just take a real quick look at this. We're talking about 4/4 timing. Here's one that this is a long note. We're not even going to talk about that. We'll get into it. Here's a double whole note, and that's going to work out to 2 measures. And you've got a whole note here that's going to work out to 1 measure in length. You've got a half note that's going to work out to half a measure in length. Quarter note that's going to work out to a quarter of a measure in length. Eighth note that's going to be an eighth of a measure in length. Then you're going to get to 16th note, a 16th of a measure in length, and so on and so forth up to the smaller and smaller note values. And that's pretty simple when you're just dealing with 4/4. It's pretty simple to understand some of the basic concept of there's 4 quarter notes in one measure. There's going to be two half notes in one measure. There's going to be 8 eighth notes in one measure, and that's real simple to understand in 4/4. So what happens if we change to a different time signature? Okay, so a simple example is we just changed to 3/4. So the time signature is 3/4. So you would think that, a half note is half the measure, correct? So I put a half note on here, and it's supposed to be half the measure. So I put another half note on here, and what happens? Well, it's not half the measure. It went into that quarter note, and then another quarter note to equal a half note, and it went into the other measure. So it didn't work out that way, did it? Okay, so the simple basic understanding of that is when the time signature is even, that the even notes are going to work out even across what's happening. But anytime the signature is odd, any type of odd time signature, that it's going to have that type of relation and those things happening to where it's not going to work out to half. Does that make sense? Because now you're dealing with a note that's basically an evening time signature that, from an even a half, that's real even. But if you've only got 3 trying to get half, it's going to be, it's not going to be half, right? Unless it's 1.5. Well, it doesn't really do that, does it? So, that's the biggest thing to keep in mind when you're talking about those notes and their relation to the time signature. If you can understand that if it's even, they're going to fit. And if it's odd, like 3/4 is odd. So, anything that's odd kind of timing like that those notes that are set up for an even, measure are going to have odd results, when you place them in the measure, and just keep that in mind. And that's a real simple concept. Okay, dots. Real simply, when you've got a dot on a note, that it increases the note by half its duration. So if you have a half note, what is it going to be? It's going to be a half plus a quarter, correct? And that's a real simple concept to understand, that it's just increasing the note by half its value. And a double knot's going to do what? Double of that. That simple. All right, a tie. You have a tie right here. Now, what's going to happen when you put a tie on there? Let's say you've got the tie on here. What is that representative? Well, what that means is you've struck this note here, and the duration is that long as long as those 2 notes, but this second note isn't getting struck again because it's got a tie on it. That means that it's seen as one note that has one strike on it, but it's the duration of those notes, and that can be 2 or 3 notes or 4 notes or however many long as you got. It's that simple. All right, rests. You have a rest here. So what happens when you put a rest on there? What does that do? That basically, very basically, is it means you don't do anything. That instrument rests for that period of time, and that rest can have a value of any of those notes and any of those additions to those notes that you can append onto that rest to make that rest the duration that you want, that the instrument is silent. It's that simple. Sharps and flats and natural signs we've talked about. Anytime you have a time signature, that the time signature is on here and it says that this G note here is going to be sharp, and you don't want it to be sharp for when you're playing the composition. So what would you do? On that note, you would select that note and you would select it to have a natural sign on it, so that them looking at the key signature, seeing that the G is sharp, that it wouldn't be. It's played natural. Also, if you have 2 of them in line and you've got a G sharp and the next note you want a G natural, if this one's been sharped or something like that, they'll assume the next one is sharped also, so you would want to put a natural on it. But anyway, that just naturalizes the note from being sharp or flat, whether you're dealing with, you've put sharps or flat on there, or it's from the key signature to deal with that. And we've already talked about sharps and flats and what that means. And double flat is very obvious, double flatting that note, and double sharpening that note, bringing it up 2 instead of 1 half step, or down 2 instead of 1 down half step. That simple. We've already talked about clefs, the treble clef here and the bass clef, so you have a pretty good understanding what that is. And you understand that that treble clef, it's based around and it's wrapped around that G note always. And unless you change it, that's where it normally should be. And this one is going to be, the bass clef is going to be set on that F note so that you can reference that for where you're at on the actual staff. Other types of clefs, I suggest you Google that, and you may have use for them and you may not. Depends on what you're doing. If you're doing some symphonic stuff or some type of compositions, that you might have some needs for just some different types of clefs. So I suggest you just Google that to see, what kind of different ones there are and what uses they might have. Key signatures we already talked about, so you should have a pretty good understanding of what that means, so that when you're playing in C and it's got no key signature, no sharps or flats, that's C. And when you start sharpening, flattening it, it's because you've taken that scale structure and made the root some other note, or your scale is some different form. You use different notes to construct a scale, so different notes are going to be sharp and flat in that scale to dictate what the key would be for that. And it's that simple. All right, grace notes. Grace notes are really simple. You're going to want to Google that also, but basically what a grace note is if you've got a note here that it's going to be, this is the primary note, but you want another note just right before it, or maybe even right after it, that is just barely heard at a very quick duration or something like that. That's all a grace note is. So it's like da-da, or something that's really fast. It's just barely hitting it before it goes into that primary note that you're wanting to voice. And it's that simple, but there are different types that you want to look at. All right, we've already talked about time signatures, so you should have a pretty good understanding of that. Your basic time signature 4/4, 4 beats per measure with a quarter note designated by the bottom number gets 1 beat. So that's real simple. The other thing is common time and half time, cut time. Basically, common time is 4/4, and half of that would be 2/4. So it's that, or 2/2. So it's really simple, and in your mind, keep it that simple. And we've already talked about that enough to where you should have an understanding of the time signature. And complex time signatures we discussed, and you should be able to break them down to where that you can work with complex uses of time signatures and break them down into smaller sections so you can understand the complexity of what they're doing. Bar lines on your staff. These are just basic bar lines that tell you when you're going into a different measure or where a measure ends. Something like a bar line that looks like this is going to be a final bar line. One like this is going to show you got to repeat, like you've got these 3 or 4 measures that you want to repeat. You'd put that bar line at the beginning of it, that bar line at the end of it. And this bar line basically does the same thing, but it's for that you've got an end on one that you've repeated, and you're going to start another one that's going to have another repeated phrase in it. And some of the double bar line, some of the dotted bar lines and dashed bar lines, things like that are very specific, and you should kind of look at them. I don't know how much you'll use them. Really depends on what type of production you're working in. All right, things like slurs here. That can be, as far as like a guitar is concerned, it's like a hammer-on or a pull-off on a guitar, but it can be very different on a piano, and it almost works out to an articulation. And sometimes it's very hard to define exactly what that means, if there's not some notation. Basically, it's going to denote some type of articulation that's happened that's not easily defined, and basically probably needs some notation with it. This right here, a crescendo, that means that, you've got this measure, and, it's going, four measures, and you put this on here, or one measure, however many measures, and you put this on here to show that it's from a decreased volume and building, and the other one would be from a larger volume decreasing in volume. And that's a very simple understanding. Keep it that simple in your mind. All right, the articulations and ornaments is something you really need to look into, because it can be very different for different instruments, what exactly that means. Simple ones like a trill, trills and things like that, you kind of want to look up, and to really understand what's happening there. Some of those concepts can get a little complex. Holding a note, something like that's very simple. Staccatos, striking a note quickly and letting it off, things like that. Some of them are very simple. Some of them can be very complex, and you really want to just kind of look at articulations and ornaments in music notation and just kind of peruse it and make a copy of it, and spend a little bit of time understanding them, because it can be very different when you're dealing with different instruments. So just a general understanding of it is sometimes very difficult. So I definitely recommend you just peruse those. It shouldn't take you too long to get a basic understanding of most of the basic articulations and ornaments that you'll probably be dealing in most things that you're working with. All right, dynamic articulations or signatures. Things like PPP, PP, F, FF, FFF. Those are things that are dealing with soft, super soft, kind of soft, pretty soft, some kind of soft, not soft, degrees of softness and force. So that you're dealing with basically dynamics of, the P being the soft end and how soft that you kind of want to play it, and the F's being how hard you want to play it and how much dynamic aggressiveness you want. And that can be very hard to say, because, it can really depend on the composer, because when you get into that stuff, the generalization of it can be very easy. But when you look at real complex compositions, that sometimes the composer, is like, no, that's, you're playing more F, not FF, and you're like, what? So you basically got, they can be very sticklers about that, and you can run into some issues. But that's the basic understanding of what those are doing. All right, beats per minute. Beats per minute is kind of simple. That you've got the type of note and how many beats it gets per minute, and normally that's written as BPM, beats per minute, and it's that simple. Don't get it any more complicated in your head. It'll denote what note gets how many beats per minute. So that this right here, this quarter note is going to get 80 beats per minute, and it's that simple. And try to keep it that simple in your head. All right, so I hope that addressed most of the real basics of it, and we are going to, in the next video, talk, because we're going to need some more time to talk about some of these things, some of the things that we're talking about here, and some of these other notations that can be a little bit complex, but I just don't have enough time in this video to address them. So I hope that addressed the basics for you. Some of the concepts you might have to dig around a little bit, but the basic understanding of what's happening there, by the time you get done watching the next video, that you should have at least a basic understanding of it. And for things you're not really understanding, very good direction to go find out, well, what is that or what that's doing, with a much finer tuned target, for what you're looking for and need to understand. Peace, hope, love.